As a way of getting back into it this morning, I might just go back over our purpose and go through the objectives and then introduce Helen to speak with us. Our purpose is to examine the application of career development services to the creation of effective workforce development strategies. When we were talking last night, and this morning, it seems like there's already a little bit of a theme emerging around that, and that is around this notion of infrastructure. What is the infrastructure required to do that? The objectives that we have set ourselves are to examine how career development services can be better used to respond to the workforce development challenges and support workforce development goals, to make links between career development and workforce development clear for all stakeholders. And I think there's some notions about just whether we've done that effectively, particularly in relation to the employers. A future development of international vision for career services delivery, building on International Symposia. To further develop national visions and action plans for implementing results of the Shaping the Future. To learn from promising practices and action plans of other countries. And I think a number of people have come here today hoping to get that. So the more sharing that takes place, and we've made a good start, the better off and the more worthwhile their trips will be. To make good use of existing resources, many of which are in your satchels. And to identify critical next steps on the agenda to move forward as an international community. I might also remind you of what the outputs are. A communique with a set of recommendations for different stakeholders. An international action plan, including the International Centre for Career Development and Public Policy and the future symposia. And we've got a couple of the delegates planning to host a symposia, which you probably all know about in Scotland in 2007. And Ramo Vuuranen is mentioned hosting one in European one in 2006 later this year. For European delegates. And we'll talk about that. And Shaping the Future papers and proceedings. So 4 things. You might remember that when we first sent out our invitations to you that one of the first themes was around the notion of human capital. The questions were raised. Well, what is it? What is the role of each of the stakeholders? And how do career management skills fit? And how can enterprise employer needs be reconciled with individual needs? It's a huge challenge and one which we will spend some time on this morning looking at. It's probably useful at this point to start to get the definitions. So we sort of work from a position of a shared view of what we're talking about when we're talking about career development. And even though many of you have very different definitions of what you mean by career development, and I say this, we're using career development in this discussion in the same way as some of the countries are using career guidance. So we're using it as that overarching term. It's the kind of term that we speak of in Australia, and we accept that other countries may use career guidance. And this is from the OECD definition. And that is services intended to assist individuals of any age and at any point throughout their lives to make educational, training and occupational choices and to manage their careers. So that's that frames up what we're thinking about when we're thinking about career development. Similarly, when we're thinking about human capital, at its most simplest definition, and I'm sure Helen might have something to say about the more complexities of that definition, the knowledge, skills and competencies of the workforce. It's so our theme and symposium has an intrinsic relationship between this notion of human capital and the broader context of what we're saying in terms of shaping the future and its relationship to workforce development. Before I introduce Helen, I want you to think about as you listen to Helen, you may wish to take some notes and get some questions and think about the perspectives for discussion afterwards. So maybe take out the there's a sheet in there, I think it's the blue sheet. It's related to, I think I brought it up stage. And just have it on the table there. If you haven't got one, we can raise your hand and Catherine will bring you over one. It's session 1, blue sheet. Okay. All right. Good. You'll see in there'll be there's 4 questions. How do you understand human capital in relation to career development? How do you understand human capital in relation to workforce development? What questions, points of clarification, reflections would you like to follow up with Helen? So that'll be the task. We are delighted to have Helen Silver with us today. The Department of Premier and Cabinet in Victoria has been leading the human capital agenda in Australia. Human capital agendas are of significant importance in Australia right now because there have been meetings between the Committee of Australian Governments to look at this very issue about in relation to a national reform agenda. We are looking at a very huge policy agenda on this issue. It will focus national policy agendas for some time. Both Helen and Terry Moran from that department have worked have put significant effort into this process. And it might be in your program that Terry's there, but Helen will be speaking on this occasion. I'd like to say a couple of words about Helen before getting to the stage. Helen is Deputy Secretary of Policy and Cabinet at the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Victoria. Prior to this, Helen held the position of Deputy Secretary Economic and Financial Policy at the Department of Treasury and Finance. Helen has had many years' experience in senior management positions in the Victorian and Commonwealth public sectors, centred around the provision and management of high-level policy advice and operational systems. She's worked in other areas like the Productivity Commission and Government Business Enterprise Division. As a careers advisor, we're always interested in people who have these kind of full-on, high-pressured sort of roles. And can I welcome Helen this morning to come and talk to us? Could we give her a award?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today. I think I've got to just do this. That's me. It's a pleasure to be here today. I note the interesting array of topics that are going to be covered by the synopsis and the fact that I think it's fantastic, there's an international perspective that's been brought to bear on these issues. I'm going to try and provide a context for your discussion as I understand it, and it's essentially, obviously, from an Australian point of view. It's trying to look at some of the themes that you're going to be looking at today. I think that my talk, which you'll have to attest to, is whether it provides a relevant backdrop to some of the ideas covered in what I see as Theme A, connecting career development to workforce development. Theme B, career development for young people, workforce preparation. Theme C, career development for adults at work, workforce, what you're calling workforce adaptability. And Theme D, career development for re-entrance to work, workforce integration. My perspective is not from what you're looking at, which is very much a practical, technical view of how do you actually do this. It's more talking about why I think it's important and how the work we're doing is actually at the front end of what you're doing and how the two perhaps can be melded together. So basically I'm going to go through 4 areas. I'll be outlining the Australian context for a need for human capital development. Our perspective is very much from the economic imperative for reform in human capital. I'm then going to talk about human capital reform issues in the context of what we call the National Reform Agenda, and very much now at the Commonwealth level as part of the communique which Prime Ministers and Premiers have talked about. They talk about it as the National Reform Agenda. We originally put it in Victoria as the National Reform Initiative. It's essentially the same thing. So if you look at a document, you'll see the same. I'll delve in some of the issues of the National Reform Agenda, and I'm particularly going to look at issues that relate to education, lifelong learning. This human capital National Reform Agenda is larger, but at the same time it's all interconnected, as well our perspective is anyway. Now then I'll make some comments I hope that are relevant and don't seem, from a person that's not technically involved with this, relevant in terms of career development. So let me talk about what probably I can give you the most relevance to. Since mid-2005, last June, the Victorian Government has actually pursued a sustained campaign to try and build a consensus amongst Australian governments for a third wave of national reform. This is also obviously not just about Australian governments, but it's about the Australian community, but our focus is actually obviously to get the Australian governments to agree to this, because we think through that process we then actually can affect the change. As pointed out, it's actually been done through the forum of what is called the Australian Governments, which is known as the Council of Australian Governments, or as you'll hear, what's called COAG. It is attended by all First Ministers of Australian governments, that is essentially, from our point of view, Prime Ministers and Premiers, and a vast array of us senior officials supporting them in making these processes work. COAG has overseen many areas of Australian public policy development. Things you may or may not be aware of is a thing called the National Competition Policy that came out of COAG, and it's actually from that, which was what we say is the second wave of reform in Australia, which occurred from the mid-90s to the early 2000s, which actually we believe allowed Australia to have a massive productivity boost, came out of COAG. And that's why we say there's a third wave, and this is the third wave of human capital. It also has dealt with important issues for Australia to do with counter-terrorism and security arrangements, health reform, water reform. So it's an area that tries to grapple with the big questions and get a framework and some agreement. So we basically, before there was a major COAG meeting in June 2005, before that meeting we were very much concerned that from a range of areas that we were not going to be able to grapple with the key questions, and the Victorian Government, through the Premier, wished to basically put on the table what he saw was a major agenda. We released at this time a number of papers which advocated the need for what we call a collaborative, broad and cross-cutting reform by Australian governments to support productivity and participation and to sustain future prosperity. I'll show you later, if you wish to get any of these documents, they're actually available on our website and the COAG website. So I didn't bring them today because I thought you don't want to carry these things around. But they're all there, and some of the details that I only touch on, and there is a lot of substantial details in these documents, they're not just a couple of pages, you may wish to reflect on and look at. But I'll go quickly in what was the case for national reform. And I just really think it's important to talk about this. Australia has enjoyed 15 years of consecutive years of economic growth. And when this time we've shown these documents, we climbed from 18th to 8th on the global income ladder over that period. We see there were 2 major waves of economic reform behind this, and this was what was described by the OECD and the economists. Australia was called the miracle economy. The first wave of reform from early 1980s saw the floating of the Australian dollar, the deregulation of financial markets, and the effective end to tariff barriers designed to protect Australian industry. So this all changed. It's brought a huge impact into the Australian economy. The second wave, which I talked about before, came out of COAG conference in the mid-1990s, and that looked at an agreement on national competition policy as its absolute centrepiece. That basically tried to seek to increase competition and required the supports of Commonwealth, state and territory governments. And it really focused around issues about what was the role of government in areas like electricity. It focused about if you have these enterprises within government, how do you make them competitive? It was very much a focus on trying to reduce business regulation. Mind you, I say that it still continues on that side to be a major problem. But there was a huge raft of policies that were implemented as a part of this change. So we actually said there needs to be a third wave of reform. And what were they, and what were the challenges that loomed because of that? We saw this occurred, and there's work being done in Federal Treasury, and the Victorian Government also has done a fair amount of work in the Productivity Commission about global economic power and changes in the global economic power, but also very fundamentally, which is a worldwide phenomenon, which is the ageing of our population. So these new challenges, just to give you a sense of what they are, because it's really important, even though we're going from career development, to understand this broader picture, is the challenges are, from Australia's perspective, China will overtake the United States as the world's largest economy, with India making up the top three. This will bring for Australia new competition in both low-wage and high-wage jobs and industries. So you have to reflect on that. In Australia, we're going to have fewer young entrants into the labour market, with more of us living longer, and add up to a projected fall, which all adds up to a projected fall in workforce participation rates. Associated with this, there is definitely going to be costs of rising of ill health and welfare dependency as you get this ageing population. Basically, this is actually, and the Federal Treasury and the Productivity Commission have produced numbers, and we've actually verified them ourselves. It's going to produce what is called a fiscal gap, a money gap, a budget gap of around 6.5% of GDP by 2041 in Australia. This is absolutely a substantial gap which needs to be funded. We certainly felt, and I think now there's very much a strong view, and I'm sure the Australian Government believes this, that it can be avoided, this scenario of this fiscal gap, if we work together. And it's to do with taking the essence of the lessons of the previous ways of reform and to position Australia in the context of these major trends which are reshaping economies and societies. The nature of the policy task before Australia is well understood, and the OECD suggests in the Economic Survey of Australia in 2004, and I'll just read it to you. Rising to these challenges will require policies that increase both productivity growth and labour inputs over the longer term. These are ambitious objectives, but by no means impossible. Australian productivity levels are well below those in several other OECD countries, as are participation rates among working age population groups. So the work you're doing is highly relevant to this obvious problem. So we took this in June. It got a fair good of a tick and to go on to work. At the meeting in February, there was a substantial move forward where First Ministers agreed there would be a national reform agenda which must focus on lifting productivity and workforce participation. The development of this national reform agenda is currently occurring with a variety of government officials working in working groups that will report back to COAG and other ministerial councils, and we're right in the middle of it at the moment. I chair a working group, and the Commonwealth obviously chair a number of the working groups, and we're in a number of meetings that are much smaller than this, but essentially trying to drive out and work through what does this actually mean in a practical reality. We're going to have our next meeting in July of COAG First Ministers, which we will then get another, which we hope tick off, and agreement on a number of the issues that relate to this going forward. So it's quite real, it's happening now. So basically, what is the National Reform Agenda? It's to increase productivity and participation. Basically, to do this, we think we need to improve the competitiveness of our businesses and build the capabilities of our people. Highly relevant to what you're working on. New reform programs are required in the areas of competition, regulation and human capital. Obviously today I'm not going to be talking much about the competition and regulation area, but there's still further work to do there, and opportunities were certainly identified to go forward. And in regulation, like a number of international countries, we're facing a huge and growing burdens of compliance of regulation. The OECD describes a third element, which is the human capital, as the fundamental building block of growth strategies in a knowledge-based economy. So I'm taking their definition, and we've used this in documents that we've worked on. So let me just give you a sense of what this national reform agenda is. The diagram represents the different bases of the national reform agenda, and we are effectively working in working groups exactly under this framework. The communique, which is the document that First Ministers put out when they do each of their meetings, essentially doesn't have this diagram, but talks about the national reform agenda being competition and efficiency, regulation and human capital, which I think is actually very interesting, that First Ministers are actually talking in the language of human capital, which is not what you would necessarily expect Prime Ministers and Premiers to talk through. You might see it through education programs, what you're talking about, career development, but they're talking at the higher order, which is about the whole concept of what human capital is. And it was a bit of a debate, but certainly once First Ministers work through their understanding of that, they're very comfortable with these terms now. When you look at human capital, what the Victorian Government's position has been is that we need to develop a healthier, skilled and more motivated workforce if our businesses are to compete and succeed in the global economy. A capable workforce will be essential if we are to develop new products and new services and apply new technologies and processes. In developing its position on the third wave of reform, the Victorian Government undertook a series of financial modelling of the potential economic significance of what this reform agenda could be. The takeout of the modelling was that this new reform agenda could approximately add 3 to 5% to annual GDP growth after 10 years. Now, I talked about the fiscal gap before. Essentially, if you do this, you close the gap. So there's a real imperative. Most of the economic and financial benefits after 10 years will be delivered by the human capital agenda, especially from improving workforce participation. In the first 10 years, it's actually quite interesting. You see that the growth actually comes from this part, which is competition and regulation. But it's not surprising, because of the nature of investments in education and health, that it takes some time to hit your actual underlying growth. But once it does, if you change these parameters, you get a massive growth spurt and freeing of capital once you do this. And everybody knows investments in education and health take a long time to bed down, a long time to get in, but once you do change things. So over the longer period, 25 years, the potential benefits of reform are much larger, potentially adding between 19 to 14% to annual GDP. The economic contribution from reforms to education and health, as I've said, become relatively more important once we get down a longer time frame. That is, higher educational attainment means more skilled workers and higher productivity, while improved health outcomes are associated with increased labour force participation. If you're healthier, you're more likely to stay in the workforce. Basically, that's the underlying thesis. So what is this thing that we did here? We not only put it into this context, we also tried to speak about this as it being in the context that it's actually a different way of looking at human capital. This next diagram represents the way that the human capital agenda seeks to lift participation by extending the reach of good health, relevant skills and reward for effort to more Australians, and lifting our productivity by working smarter rather than simply working harder. As the slide shows, the National Reform Agenda really is underpinned by a view that there is a life cycle, that you need to encourage the best outcome for the individual and for the benefit of the economy and society in general. Basically, the traditional focus of Australian social policy has been to ensure individuals and families against key life risks: disease and disability, unemployment and productivity. Over the decades ahead, we're basically saying this focus must shift towards preventing problems from arising in the first place, rather than dealing with their consequences. This is an important shift and has the best evidence models show that this type of shift can have huge impacts both on the economy, but I would also say for individuals. Preventable disease, far better to prevent mental health than to deal with mental health, which everybody knows is basically not curable once you're in that cycle. Prevention and early intervention need to become what we see as the hallmarks of a social policy that supports people to develop and maintain their capabilities through their lives. This will require a much more integrated approach to health, education and work policies, and a greater emphasis on policies to promote early childhood development, preventative health and lifelong learning, which is essentially, I see, as the area that you're focusing on. Just quickly talk about, there's a need for a much greater focus on early childhood development, given the enormous evidence, and it is best practice scientific evidence, that if you focus on early childhood development, this will improve long-term and social benefits to individuals and the economy. I don't know if any of you have seen the evidence that's around about early childhood development and the implications for young people, and I meaning 0 to 3, when all the brain development occurs, if they are in the wrong circumstances. Basically, if you don't deal with this problem, you are actually saying for their whole lives, the society has actually walked away from these individuals because we could solve and make sure they have a much more productive and happier life. It's without a doubt, and a lot of very good Canadian research is showing this. And I personally, fundamentally, this is the big thing for me about why we have to do this. Another thing, though, is type 2 diabetes and mental ill health, which again relates to early childhood development, are really largely preventable and unnecessarily preclude large numbers of people from participating in the workforce. So why are we not focusing? Now, there's a really good reason. I won't go into today about the reasons for that, and it's a bit to do with how state governments win and lose elections and why we don't have the focus, and it's a bit about why we go here. But what I really want to focus on, because it's more where you're at, is the National Reform Agenda to do with education and training. Sorry, I think I have to go back here. So basically, what did this approach tell us about education and training? And perhaps I'll just go back for a minute because it's going to go back here. Yeah. Why this is important, a lot of policy, and you're all in this, is you get the silo mentality. You know, I'm in education, I work on career development, and that's my space. Really, essentially, this is actually about saying that there is a requirement when you look at these issues to look across questions. So early childhood development is a classic one where you'll have in 3 areas, we found what we call 3 ministerial councils, all working on early childhood development. A couple in education, in different parts of education, and 1 in health. None of them were talking to each other, all had their own agenda. Why is that happening? Now that's happening because we create systems that, create incentives for people to do that. Part of this change is actually saying and looking at these questions. These are much broader than single silo. They cut across questions to do with the whole education system and training system, which is where you're at, rather than career development being a narrow focus. It's actually a much more broader issue that focus in. And from your point of view, healthier individuals and more capable individuals are also more likely to be able to take a set of advice. So it's actually trying to change that lens. And ultimately, if you go down this route, I think there would be changes in how governments need to deal, and the matrix model's even got to get more, or there has to be other institutional changes. So just to go back, though, what did we mean in education and training? Because you have to actually try to break this thing down, otherwise you end up getting overloaded by the largeness of it. Essentially, what you see up here is, there's so many pictures to this, but the National Reform Agenda, one of its key themes is, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to say First Ministers will commit to a national reform agenda, which is about raising workforce participation and productivity. And how do they do that? How do they do that lens? It's essentially about saying First Ministers will commit to be accountable, which is Prime Ministers and Premiers, for the outcomes of the Australian economy in relationship to some key outcomes. And these are the outcomes we're working on at the moment to agree on, and in terms of education and training. They're basically saying, First Ministers, we will agree on these outcomes. We will essentially behind this agree that we can measure progress on these outcomes, so we can actually have data that measures progress. Then underpinning that, once we have this framework, there is a range and diversity of policies that we think are best practice that states and governments and Commonwealth governments can work together to actually get this change. I hope that helps you understand this broader thing. Now, where you're working through is obviously underneath in some of these policy actions. But the thing about this model is also about saying outcomes matter, that you're not doing policy for nothing. You're doing it because it affects these outcomes. And certainly I've seen in government that if you actually give departments and ministers accountability for an outcome and they fail if they don't achieve it, it actually changes the direction of resources. That's why we think this sort of model actually cuts through some of these questions. So these particular outcomes, I won't go through how we got through that, but they come out of the life cycle approach. It emphasises the need for early childhood development so that children enter school with basic skills for life and learning. It aims to improve the proportion of young people who meet basic literacy and numeracy standards and to lift overall productivity levels and achievement. It then seeks to increase the proportion of young people who will make good transitions from school to work or further study, and then to increase the proportion of adults who undertake lifelong learning throughout their careers. So I'll focus in on lifelong learnings. So what did that mean for us? Improving transitions from school to work or further study has been identified as an important part of the lifelong learning area. Australian governments have initiated a host of reforms and service improvements in the past, aimed at assisting those leaving school early and those at risk of leaving school early. Areas for action have included school leaving age, alternative pathways to Year 12 equivalent qualifications, community partnerships, customised support and better tracking of school leavers. Notwithstanding these efforts, the past 2 decades have seen very little change in the proportion of young people not engaged in full-time education, training or employment, despite low overall employment levels. If you're going to get this increase in workforce participation, it's got to come from somewhere. And this is the area it's going to have to come from. Because, as you would know, migration is not essentially going to give it. We've got this workforce that's sitting there who probably does want to participate, but what we're doing is not getting them into the workforce. It was agreed at COAG that the relevant Ministerial Council, the Ministerial Council for Employment, Education, Training and Youth Affairs, would report back to COAG by June 2006, I understand now that's July 2006, on strategies to ensure that policies and programs relating to transition pathways from school to work are developed and delivered to achieve nationally agreed objectives, and we will be imposing on them, certainly we'll be trying to, these outcomes, and ensure that information is collected to track youth transitions. I find it fascinating in doing this work that we really actually don't understand where our youth end up. It's a very, very poor data set. So if you can't measure it and understand it, you as I would know, it's very difficult to develop well-targeted policies. There are areas that are likely to be looked at under this council, and this is not going to be the end of the story. It'll be the start of a story that feeds into a much longer-term process. Is likely looked at improvement of coordination between governments in transition to disengaged young people, but also more broadly ensure that governments are offering young people the information, advice and opportunities that can help them develop capacities that are needed for an active and productive working life. So I think you can see there is a direct link in here through the processes that you're working on. Another important element of the lifelong learning is increasing the proportion of adults with skills and qualifications they need to enjoy active and productive lives. We know that in the future, that a declining proportion of population will be of working age, that the premium for skilled workers will be increasing. It will become important more than ever to develop and use relevant work skills and to use learning and using new skills throughout your working life. And it's an imperative that governments must help people in the working population to achieve that, because if we don't do that, people will start still making the decision, especially the way our superannuation laws operate, I think I'll get out of the workforce at a much earlier age than really the economy needs them, and probably for their life that they need in terms of their interests and maintaining their health. So, of course, it's obviously old hat to you that the notion of education is something when you do young is outdated, but we've always been saying that. But this is about that we now have to make this a reality. Relative to other nations, Australia has a very high rate of adult participation in education and training, but a low proportion of adults with a base qualification equivalent to Year 12. It's actually very interesting to see this. Our skilled people, once you're in it and you're doing it, it's fine. But we're losing because we're losing this huge bulk of potential capable people who could be part and enjoying, I'm sure, much more enriched working lives if they were able to achieve and continue to go forward in terms of this basic qualification. Again, I think a crying shame. I mean, it's just there's base qualifications. We're not talking about PhDs. We're just talking about real base qualifications. It is important that policy supports people to attain the skills and qualifications demanded by business and the economy. It is a challenge we see for COAG to develop a policy framework to support greater policy innovation to encourage what we see as lifelong learning. And I won't go into another facet of this, but it is about this concept of policy innovation. We don't think one size fits all. We think in these areas of social policy, experimentation, different innovative models often can produce a much, much better outcome and enrich the possibilities for states to implement these policies. So human capital and the career development. In doing this, I sort of tried to think about, well, looking at it, the lens that you're coming at it from where I've been trying to show you this other lens. An important part of the national reform agenda that is being developed is to obviously ensure, as I keep saying, lifelong view of workforce participation. It is a high-level and strategic policy agenda, but it needs also from the ground up to ensure there is effective implementation. In my view, career development policies are an implicit part of achieving goals such as having effective public policy support for lifelong learning. Good career education is a proven strategy to improve school retention rates, youth transition to further education and employment. Good career education also encourages the individual to lifelong learning by improving the private returns on education and training effort. You're increasing the incentive to the individual, and as you know, that's the most important encouragement to undertake further training. A groundbreaking feature of the National Reform Agenda would be that Australian governments agree not in this area, as I've said, to just a set of policies, but allows a set of the jurisdictions to achieve and underpin and agree to these outcomes to a range of policy actions so that we can improve the youth transitions by a certain amount. As I keep saying, there is not one model, and I think you're going to be looking at a number of models. I think this competition of ideas is how we're going to we are actually going to allow our governments to achieve these outcomes, which we hope they do sign, as they're very important if we are going to achieve this aspiration. So today I've given an overview of what I think the Australian context is to how what you're working on fits into this broader public policy discussion that is really actively underway under the COAD agenda. Should you wish to look at the various publications and papers emerging on this issue, they're actually all on our website, and some are also on the COAB website. So you can see them. They're under, if you look at ours, it'll be the National Reform Initiative, and we'll have the COAD communiques. Under the Council of Australian Government website, where you most want to look at is for the February meeting, where there's a document in there which is called the National Reform Agenda. I chaired the working group on that. There's a large document in there which really goes through, and I think if you're interested in it, there's a whole chapter in there on education, and within that there's a lot of this discussion. And we actually talk about some of the questions that you're facing and say, what is the best practice evidence that is going around the world in these areas? So you might find them useful in further thinking on these questions. So thank you very much. And I'll finish.
I'd like to thank Helen very much for that presentation. It just shows you how much of a pinnacle that good public service could be when you're looking at agendas which are going to change people's lives. So I'd just like to acknowledge that at the moment. And now, before we ask questions, I'd like Lynn Bezanson just to come up here and just go through that process. Thanks.
Well, I think we certainly have enough to reflect on, and that's what I wrote down in terms of reflection, so I was really happy that we took out those blue pages in advance so we could kind of focus our thinking. What I want to do, just to get the group started all on the same page, is just very quickly run through what we're going to ask you to do for the next 30 minutes. This is the first time that you will have met together in a group, and you have one of the SICA group monitors at each of the tables whose role it will be to facilitate the discussion and to keep you on track in terms of moving through the questions. But the first thing is obviously to say hello to each other. So we want to ask at each table to introduce yourself just quickly, your name, your country, portfolio, just so you know who each other are, and that you can put a name to a face and begin to create a new relationship. The next task is to spend a few moments and just go around the table sharing some of the things that you may have reacted to when you heard Helen speaking. Thinking about it from your own country context. Does your country have the kind of vision that was present in what Helen was saying, or whatever struck you? Perhaps a point, a reflection from everyone, so you begin to have some dialogue. So spend some time on that. Then, free for all, open discussion. Did you agree with Helen? Did you disagree with her? Are there areas that you would have liked her to talk about a little bit more, or areas that you would like clarified? Sometimes areas where Helen speaks quite quickly, so you may have missed some of her points, especially if your first language isn't English. So to take a chance to look at what didn't I understand. So come to some understanding. And at about 20 minutes into your discussion, we'll stop you and ask you to come to agreement as a group on a couple of questions that your group would like Helen to address. Maybe an area that you'd like her to spend a little more time on, or you'd like to clarify or get her ideas on something that might work in your countries. And in the last 5 minutes, I'll be coming around and collecting a couple of questions from each table. Helen has very kindly agreed to stay and answer some of our questions. She won't be able to answer all of them, I'm sure, in the time that we have, but there will be enough time for a select number, and the rest of the questions we'll have typed up, so we'll all have a record of all of the questions that got addressed. So even if we can't get them all answered today, hopefully we'll have more time to really speak about those issues monitors as we socialize and chat with each other through the course of the symposium. So that's just a quick orientation to what we'd like you to do now in your groups. And could I also just make one mention around language? There are many, many languages in this room, and many people for whom English is not a second language, is not a first language, I'm sorry. And what we would really like to encourage you to do is in your small groups, ask for clarification. Please don't be shy. Ask people to repeat things or slow down or say things a little more simply if that's what you need. The important thing is that you're able to follow the conversation and really get as much out of it as you can. Count on people at your table to be sensitive to that and respect it. Except when we get excited, we speed up. So don't let us do that. If we're speeding up, look after what you need and just say, slow down. I need to follow the discussion. And the group monitors will be really helping you do that. So I just encourage you to own the agenda and to feel really comfortable with making sure you're getting it. You're here to get it. And everyone wants you to get it. So please don't be reluctant to ask when you don't understand. So with that, over to your group monitors at your table. You have 30 minutes for discussion, and I will be ringing a bell in 20 minutes to get you to focus on questions. Free discussion for 20, and we'll move from there. Thank you.
It's very interesting in Australia. We have the Business Council of Australia, which is an employer group, very large employers. And they have certainly, more and more, they have been putting out publications and they're becoming directly to us to say they actually see this as the way to go. They're very concerned with the state of Commonwealth-state relations. They're concerned about the lack of focus on the issues about workforce participation and productivity. And so they are trying to make it as part of their agenda, and they're asking, well, how can we assist? So to that extent, at the sort of higher order level of employers, I think we've got them in the frame of that. But it's actually, I agree, this type of change really requires a much more broader set of the community to want to be part of it. Now, in a cynical sense, the reason that we need this is First Ministers are obviously the most political of politicians. They are the leaders, they win power. And if your leader ain't the first priority to win power, well, they're not going to stay in power. And how they do that in Australia, and I'm sure it's replicated overseas, they understand what we call in Australia, how do you put this in terms of the punter? And in Australian terminology, that means the average person. What does it mean for me when I go to work, when I want my kids to get a job, when my mother can't get into a nursing home? What does that mean? And we're looking at how do we actually, and we try to get the Premier to talk in that language of what does it mean for the punter. And I think that's a lot of the effort and work we'll be doing, not so much by me, but people that are much better communicators in that area about putting our thinking into that. But I think it's eminently able to be, because it is all about, I want my child to have an ability to have a good job, but continue to have a good job throughout the rest of their life. I have children that are significantly disadvantaged. Generally in the community there is concern for them. There's a lot of money going to it, but it's not working. Community understands that if we could get it to work in the right areas, in the long term, they feel better as a community. They don't want these kids that are left on the waste heap. So all those things.
I think the next question is really focused on this new word that I've just learned, a punter, which is just the average person. So a question was raised around, in this agenda, how do you address what happens in many countries where there's a skills mismatch? We have people with high qualifications, but they're in low-skill jobs. So it's that different part of how will your agenda address that so that people are matched according to their qualifications? Or do you see that as an issue in Australia?
I think there
it's a range of issues. Really, in Australia, probably the more bigger issue, although I think that is a real issue, because particularly for people who are recently migrated and they would have very good high-level skills, but they're not actually achieving them. It's particularly in that area we have that problem. We also have, which I raised, the more real big, large problem, which is we have far too many young people not achieving Year 12 and equivalent, which, as you would all know, is the starting point to having good, reasonable jobs for the rest of your life. So whilst I think there's the two issues here, how this works is both from the point of view of agreeing, as we say, on these are the outcomes we want, so that's increasing the portion of school, entering school with basic skills, but is increasing the proportion of young people, etc., those outcomes that I talked about. But the ultimate outcome of this whole agenda, as I talked about, is growth. And when you have a highly strong, growing economy that is decreasingly not welfare dependent, that type of economy creates better jobs. And it's in the creation of those better jobs that these people who have better skills have greater opportunity to actually compete for those jobs. So I actually see it as a function of what comes out of it in terms of them. For those that don't have the basic skills, I think it's very much deeply about the policy actions we undertake.
I think this next, there's a whole set of questions that touch on the issue of outcomes. And you've mentioned outcomes, Helen, several times, as this whole agenda is driven by proof. So a couple of questions here are around, when we think about career development, what sorts of outcomes would people who are responsible for this agenda accept as evidence that career development really is a linchpin contributor to what you're trying to achieve? And kind of a second question to that, how do we start to get support for actually gathering data and doing research that demonstrates the impact of initiatives? And so I know those are two very broad questions, but perhaps the outcome issue would be important. And then, is there support in this agenda to support research that will be demonstrating not just immediate impact, but medium and long term, which is an issue often for our field because our results are often not immediate. They takes time for people. So maybe some comments on that.
I think I'll go a bit broad first, because I think it's very interesting, the things that you're working on. One of the outcomes of what I've been doing, it's been quite interesting in the sense that as we're focused in this area where we're saying the push for social policy should be on preventive policies as against remedial, and all the effort and dollars go into the acute end of any policy arena, all these things, there's these people that have been working in government, say in preventative health or in the areas that you have, burst out of the seams. Somebody's putting the sun on them and they're really excited. It's actually quite interesting. And we've got all these great ideas and there's all this best practice evidence, and we think this actually does work. We know it, but we could never get anybody interested enough to put sufficient resources into it to actually show it. So to some extent, I think, the work you're doing here today, and I assume is evidence of a long-term view about professionalism and best practice evidence in this area, which hasn't probably had the focus of it as a much broader agenda rather than fixing up problems at the margin, I suppose, incremental change. So I think part of it's that. And so when I look at what outcomes would influence and say, well, what I put up before, I think it's the two key outcomes of this agenda, which is increasing the proportion of young people making a smooth transition from school to work or further study. Obviously, career advice, career development is fundamental and part of that process. And increase the proportion of adults who have skills and qualifications needed to have active and productive life. Underpinning that, again, is a concept of lifelong learning, which is underpinned with knowledge about what is the right way to do this. So I think in both cases, I haven't brought with me today, but behind all this, the concept is that you put these outcomes up. We then say, well, is there measures that would tell you you've actually had progress? And the work we're doing at the moment is very much focused on what set of measures tell you that you've actually achieved that. When we've progressed it quite a substantial amount, and underpinning that again is what data exists to do that. And if a data source doesn't, what's the one that replicates it or we could produce over time? So there is a lot of work about data that will inform and underpin an understanding of tracking, if you do over time, these outcomes and measures. So that's where the data side is. And I think the area that I did comment on, there is a real lack of data. I've been quite, fascinated, because for years and years we've talked about this problem of young people and jobs. But the reality is there's very, very poor data that actually tracks them. So I've always been a person that how can you develop good policy if you don't actually understand the underlying data? What is it actually, and if it doesn't exist and it's only partial, it actually makes it even more difficult. But there's been, I understand, quite a lot of more work recently that is actually trying to focus on that question. And part of our work, if it goes forward, which I hopefully it will be about making sure not every single data set, because you can get lost in this stuff, but the very important data sets do get the support to actually be and deliver and produce that outcome. And there's a number of, Commonwealth state bodies like the Productivity Commission that have for the last 10 years trying to get better data sets in these areas. So there's a good fertile ground for this. So I think it was in that point, but is there, the research and best evidence, is there money for that? I mean, I think it's actually a quality judgment. This is a 10-year reform program. It's not about the next 6 months. There will be, because you've got to keep First Ministers and the community engaged, I would envisage by December, if we're really on the money on this, that we will agree with the outcomes, we will agree the progress measures, and we will agree some early initial actions that underpin that process. But it's a 10-year program. And so in that context, research and understanding are going to underpin a program that's of such a substantial reform nature. So it's inevitable. So I would see that would be the case.
Coming back to the punter, there's a question here that's quite interesting around the older worker, which is really an issue that's emerging in many countries. And a question around, in the agenda, what consideration is being given to encourage older workers to stay connected either to employment or to being very active at the community level? The question here is, could we have scholarships that encourage older workers to actually skill themselves for post-retirement careers, or to actually become people who share information about their trades in schools, who become really active in your human capital agenda and starting to make best use of their life experiences? What consideration, or is that a piece that's being looked at in an imaginative and innovative way? Could you comment on that?
I mean, older workers clearly is absolutely fundamental to one of those gaps that we have in Australia, where we've got substantial reduction, particularly in older male participations after 49. You see substantial drop-off. Now, some of that is about things that are to do with, let's create better quality jobs for them, let's create sort of avenues about how they could actually stay in the workforce, and they've got the skills to do so. Some of it's in another area that I didn't talk about, which is in work incentives. And this is a lot in the Commonwealth arena, which they've done a fair bit of work on, but I would say over the next 10 there'll be a lot more, which is about tax incentives, superannuation incentives, and how they operate in the market, which either discourage or disencourage you to stay in the workforce. But the other side of it is, I don't think you can forget, a lot of these older workers that are there, they are not voluntarily there. And they're not because it actually goes back to this issue that we have a lower proportion of young people and older people without a basic skill qualification. And I, again, see this as an area of how do we let this happen? It's not all about the highfalutin end. As I say, it's about the punter. It's about making sure if you haven't, and you're a blue-collar worker, as we call them in Australia, and you've been working on a building site and your back's gone, which happens. I've been working workers' comp, and I can tell you it happens a lot. that your end of life isn't on a workers' comp social security payment, it's actually into another productive part-time job, which somebody through a career counsellor has helped you, and you've got a set of skills and you're productive in the workforce. But it's not in something that uses this physical aspect of you, but actually means that you're a productive individual. And I think it's about things like that, honestly, than the others are important. I think the tax side will deal with a lot of that. It's actually this bit, and that's a core problem. But actually, in a way, I think it's fixable, but with a set of lens that actually focuses it on this way, rather than this is the cause of their own problem, they're unhealthy individuals or whatever has happened. It's actually to do with their educational attainment and the opportunities that prevents them participating in the workforce.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm sorry, but that's the time that we had for questions. I'm going to just turn the mic over to Peter to thank Helen in a moment, but could I just make one personal comment? I think just listening to the passion with which you speak about these issues, Helen, it's wonderful to see human capital really being talked about and felt about as human development. So that's what I'm hearing so much. You're talking about, well, your punter is the example, but it really is the human development portion, which is the passion of people in this room to contribute to the human capital agenda. To talk about it in those terms is really so refreshing. I've really enjoyed this session. Your questions are beautiful. We'll have them typed up, and maybe we can talk Helen into, I don't know, we'll find some way to follow up and get some more questions answered. But thank you, Peter.